A shuttle called the Kellion cuts through the silence of deep space. 5 people are aboard, an engineer, a systems engineer, a commanding officer, and 2 others whose names you will forget because they are about to die. They're heading toward a mining ship that stopped transmitting days ago. The official story is a communications failure, something routine, the kind of problem a company sends a systems engineer to fix. The Kellion docks, automated systems guided in. The lights on the Ishimura are mostly off. The corridors visible through the porthole are dark. Nobody meets them at the door. The hatches open, and something that used to be a person drops from the ceiling onto the group. In less than 30 seconds, 2 of the 5 crew members are dead. The officer takes charge and moves the survivors through a ceiling door. A necromorph tries to force it open. The group runs. In the chaos, Isaac gets separated, and then he is alone. Dead space begins there. In that silence, in that corridor, with a man who had no weapons training, carrying tools designed to cut through planetary rock, surrounded by something that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be outgunned, and cannot be stopped by shooting it in the head. Somewhere inside this ship is his girlfriend, who sent him a message days ago that sounded like goodbye, but that he told himself was fine. She said she loved him. He is here partly because of that. He just doesn't know it yet. This video is going to take that moment, that corridor, that silence, and pull it apart from the inside out. Dead Space approaches horror differently than most games in the genre. The monsters are part of it, but the real architecture of dread runs deeper than any single creature. What we are doing here is a systemic examination of manufactured hopelessness, unpacking how the game's design language, its lore, and its institutional betrayals function as a unified machine built to dismantle the player's sense of agency from the first second to the last. By the end, you won't just understand what Dead Space is about. You'll understand why it feels the way it does, why the helplessness feels personal, and why that feeling is, on some level, the entire point. Before we go further, if something in this video connects with you, whether it's a detail in the lore you'd never considered before, a psychological idea that lands in a way you didn't expect, or just a moment that sticks with you in the dark, drop a comment below. Building this kind of late-night, deep-dive community is what keeps the channel going, and some of the best video ideas have come directly from you. Throw a topic suggestion in the comments if you have one. And now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1: The Architecture of Dread. Before the first necromorph tears through a vent, before Isaac learns what happened to Nicole, before any of the larger lore begins to close in around him, Dead Space does something quietly devastating. It removes the frame. Every horror game, every film, every piece of media designed to frighten you gives you at least one thing: some small reminder that you are outside the danger, looking in. A menu screen, a pause button, a loading screen that breaks immersion just long enough to remind your nervous system that the threat is not real. Dead Space takes those exits away one by one, and it does it so smoothly that most players don't notice until they try to use one and find it isn't there. The most discussed element of this design is what the game calls the rig. The resource integration gear suit that Isaac wears is not just a costume, it is the entire interface. Every element a player would normally see on a traditional heads-up display is shown directly from the suit itself. His health meter, his inventory, his mission log, his map, all of it appears as holographic data visible in the physical world, anchored to Isaac's body rather than floating in an abstract overlay outside the game's reality. When you need to check your inventory during a combat encounter, Isaac physically raises his arm and the holographic display opens in front of him. He's still in the world, the doors around him can still open. A necromorph can still come through the vent to the left while you're staring at your ammo count. Think carefully about what that means. In most games, the inventory screen is a safe harbor. You press a button, time stops, and you can breathe. Dead Space removes that entirely. The inventory is just another part of the world that can kill you. The health bar sits on Isaac's spine, a segmented column of glowing light running down the back of his suit. Starting blue when he's healthy, it shifts through yellow and orange down to red as he takes damage. The person who can read it most easily is not Isaac. It's whoever is standing behind him. Other characters can read his health at a glance from across the room. He has to watch the color shifting at the edges of his vision, monitor the suit's warnings, and pay attention to whether his movements are becoming slower and more labored. His own well-being is something that exists primarily for others to observe, only partially accessible to him in the moment. There's something worth sitting with in that design choice. In most action games, the health bar is a privilege of omniscience. You, the player, can see it because you exist above the world, managing it from a safe distance. Dead Space collapses that omniscience. The information is still there, but you're looking at it from the same angle Isaac is. You're as trapped inside the situation as he is. The suit makes that explicit in physical, architectural terms. Here's something most people never consciously register while playing, though it shapes every moment of their experience. That spine-mounted health bar exists in the fiction as a tool for coworkers. It was designed so that other engineers on a crew could monitor each other's well-being during hazardous operations. A safety feature, a team communication tool. On a working ship, surrounded by colleagues, it would be a comfort. On the Ishimura alone, it becomes something else entirely. A display no one surviving can read. Evidence of an infrastructure built for collaboration, now functioning as a reminder that the collaboration is gone. Isaac's suit keeps transmitting his distress to a frequency no one is monitoring. But first, let's understand what the ship's own design does to him. When Isaac walks into a section of the Ishimura where the hull has been breached and the atmosphere has vented into space, sound disappears. Not the game's sound, Isaac's sound. The music doesn't just quiet down. The necromorphs become silent. The ambient hum of machinery cuts out. What remains is the hiss of oxygen cycling inside the suit, the rhythm of Isaac's own breathing, and the faint vibration of his plasma cutter firing transmitted through the metal of the weapon itself. Because in a vacuum, sound only travels through solid contact. If it isn't touching Isaac's suit, he cannot hear it, neither can you. This is one of the most deliberately unsettling design choices in the game, and understanding why it works requires looking briefly at how human beings actually process the world around them. Research into spatial orientation, the study of how people navigate and feel safe in three-dimensional environments, has found consistently that auditory feedback is more critical to a felt sense of control than most people consciously realize. We use sound to confirm that our actions have weight and consequence. The crack of footsteps tells us our feet are connecting with real ground. The ambient noise of a room tells us we understand its volume and contents. When you fire a weapon and hear the report, your brain registers that you did something real. Take away sound, and the world becomes uncanny even when you're looking directly at it. Real seeming but weightless, present but somehow unconvincing. Dead Space's vacuum sections exploit that phenomenon with surgical precision. The necromorphs in a breached corridor are still there. They're still moving, still positioning themselves, still closing the distance. You can see them, but you cannot hear them breathing, cannot hear them dragging their altered bodies across the grating, cannot hear the particular clicking sound that usually telegraphs an attack, the feedback loop that normally tells your nervous system, this action is real, has been severed, and what remains is something that feels dreamlike even while it's threatening to kill you. That dreamlike quality builds across the Ishimura's layout, which was designed to feel deliberately hostile rather than navigable. Early visual concepts for the ship featured brighter, more conventional science fiction aesthetics, the kind of grand, gleaming spaces that convey humanity's engineering achievement. Those concepts were set aside. What replaced them were narrow corridors lined with exposed pipes, heavy machinery, maintenance hatches that could open at any moment, and a lighting design that rarely gave you more than a few meters of clear visibility in any direction. The ship was designed to look used, soaked in 62 years of accumulated industrial labor, worn rather than broken, in the particular way that a tool becomes dangerous when it has been pushed beyond its intended parameters for too long. This mattered psychologically for a reason beyond aesthetics. Research into how people navigate and mentally model environments has found that humans feel less capable, less in control of themselves and their decisions, in spaces they cannot organize mentally, when corridors branch without clear markers, when rooms repeat in structure but not in function, when a space offers no reliable visual cues about what is safe and what isn't, the brain's felt sense of competence declines. Actual competence may remain intact, the felt sense of it quietly erodes. You start feeling lost even when you're moving in the right direction. You start feeling small in a space you've technically explored before. The Ishimura produces that feeling constantly. A navigation line projected from Isaac's rig guides him toward current objectives, and most players follow it almost reflexively, because without it, the ship becomes genuinely disorienting, and the game understands this. The navigation line is a lifeline that also ensures Isaac never fully learns the ship the way a person learns a space they've lived in. He always needs the guide, he never becomes comfortable. In a survival horror game where resourcefulness and spatial mastery are supposedly the player's primary assets, the Ishimura is designed to prevent either from fully developing. Save stations are scattered through the ship, physical devices Isaac approaches to record his progress. In areas where they are far apart, the tension between encounters builds into something almost unbearable, because the cost of failure grows with every step. The game doesn't conceal this arithmetic. You know that dying here sends you back to there. Every decision you make carries that weight, and the placement of save stations was clearly calibrated to control exactly how much accumulated dread a player should be carrying when they finally get to exhale. Compare this to games like the early Resident Evil entries, where save rooms functioned as genuine emotional rest stops. The typewriter in the corner, the familiar ambient music, the absence of enemies, those spaces told you that your progress was protected, your character was momentarily safe, and your nervous system could decompress. They were designed as pressure valves in the architecture of the horror, release points built into the experience itself. Dead Space offers no equivalent. Save stations don't protect Isaac. Nothing on the Ishimura protects Isaac. A necromorph can and sometimes does attack while you're at one. The act of saving provides no sanctuary. It's a mechanical necessity, taking place in the same dangerous space as everything else. The game will not let you believe, even for 30 seconds, that you've found somewhere the horror cannot reach you. Now, return to that spine-mounted health bar, the one designed for colleagues to read, the one projecting Isaac's condition to an empty corridor. Here is what that detail quietly communicates across the entire game. Dead Space was designed with the assumption of community, of infrastructure, of support, and all of it was stripped away before Isaac arrived. The suit was built for a functional world. He is wearing it in a broken one. Every feature of the rig that should represent safety, connection, and team coordination now functions as evidence of an absence. The radio system in his suit connects to nothing useful. The supply lines from the CEC that would normally allow engineers to requisition equipment are inaccessible. The mission protocols that should govern a rescue operation have collapsed into improvised survival. The REG is not just a UI design, it's a ghost of the world that should have existed, worn over the skin of a man trying to survive in the world that does. Every design decision in Dead Space, the diegetic interface, the spine-mounted health display, the silence and vacuum, the maze-like corridors, the save stations that offer no sanctuary, constructs the same wall from a different angle. That wall encloses a single conviction: there is no outside. There is no safe vantage point. You are in this world completely, and it does not care about your comfort or your survival. Most horror games build toward dread. Dead Space installs it in the architecture before you've met your first enemy. And that idea, that control, is an illusion being managed by something much larger than any single person, runs through everything Dead Space does. The mechanics establish it. The lore will prove it in detail. The institutions will confirm it in ways that are, by the end, almost difficult to look at directly. But before any of that, we need to understand what the game asks you to believe about your own power, because it gives you something. Something that feels like agency, looks like competence, and sits in your hands with the weight of genuine capability. Something designed very specifically to make you trust it, before the game shows you how wrong you were to trust it at all. Chapter 2: Tools of the Trapped. 6 minutes into Dead Space, a message appears on a blood-smeared wall. Cut off their limbs. Someone wrote it who didn't survive long enough to explain why. Isaac finds a plasma cutter nearby, a tool designed for precision work on mineral formations, something that belongs on a mining platform, something an engineer carries to work rather than to war. He picks it up. A necromorph comes around the corner. He fires. Every instinct from every other game says to aim for the center of mass, aim for the head. Both do almost nothing useful. But when a shot clips the creature's arm and the limb tears away at the joint, the necromorph staggers. When the other arm goes, it drops to the floor but keeps moving, dragging itself with nothing but the bones of its shoulders scraping across the metal grating. When both legs finally go, it stops. The game calls this strategic dismemberment. The mechanic is elegantly simple. Necromorphs cannot be killed through conventional means. Headshots accomplish very little. Pouring ammunition into a creature's torso will slow it briefly before it adapts and keeps coming. The only reliable method is surgical. Remove the limbs that allow it to move and attack, and do it before it does the same to you. This is a brilliant piece of horror game design. It also does something very specific to the player's psychology. For a few minutes, it makes you feel genuinely competent. The first time you cleanly sever an arm and watch the necromorph shift its attack pattern in response, there's a quiet satisfaction to it. You applied knowledge, and it worked. The game rewarded the correct behavior with a concrete, visible result. You went from panicked and disoriented to focused and systematic. Something in the experience communicated that you had learned how this works, that you were now someone who understood the rules. That feeling of competence is the most carefully designed deception in the entire game. Understanding why begins with what Isaac actually carries. His weapons are not weapons. The plasma cutter was built to slice compressed mineral formations at precise angles during excavation operations. The line gun was designed to cut uniform sections of rock face for ore extraction, its broad horizontal beam optimized for clean, consistent incisions in stone. The Ripper fires a spinning saw blade on a retrieval tether, originally intended for clearing debris in mining passages. The contact beam delivers a focused energy pulse developed for geological survey work. None of these instruments were created to fight anything. They are engineering tools that happen to be lethal because engineering on this scale requires working with forces powerful enough to fracture planetary matter. And something capable of cutting through a planet is more than capable of cutting through a person. Isaac is a systems engineer. Before any of this happened, his career involved maintaining the mechanical infrastructure of ships like the Ishimura, repairing power conduits, restoring atmospheric processors, troubleshooting automated systems. He had no combat training of any kind. He improvised every strategy he uses. The adapted purpose of each tool, precision cutting for dismemberment, stasis for slowing rather than stopping, kinesis for throwing rather than lifting, represents an engineer's problem-solving instinct applied to a situation his engineering education had no framework for. And here is the weight that improvisation carries through every encounter in the game. Isaac is always on the edge of not having enough. Ammunition in Dead Space accumulates slowly, through careful exploration, through stomping defeated necromorphs to release drops, through choosing which rooms to search before moving forward. The game keeps you rarely comfortable with your reserves. When you've saved up what feels like a reasonable supply of plasma cutter rounds, a new enemy type arrives that your current ammunition doesn't suit well. When you've adapted your loadout to address the new threat, the familiar forms return in configurations that cost more than anticipated to handle. When you've finally found a rhythm that works, the environment changes in ways that make that rhythm unsustainable. This is a deliberate scarcity model, and what it produces in the player is something beyond frustration. Research into how people perform and decide under conditions of genuine resource stress has found a consistent pattern. When attention narrows around an immediate shortage, the capacity for broader, longer-term thinking decreases in measurable ways. When your focus is absorbed by counting plasma cutter rounds, the mental bandwidth available for understanding the larger situation around you shrinks. The Ishimura's history, the marker's purpose, the institutional decisions that created this disaster, all of it becomes background noise while your brain works the arithmetic of ammunition. Dead Space weaponizes your own cognitive responses against your ability to understand what is happening to Isaac. The specific tools he uses reinforce this. The stasis module, which slows machinery and enemies alike, was standard engineering equipment before any of this happened. Crew members use stasis to work safely around rapidly cycling mechanical components, a door malfunctioning too fast to pass through safely, a damaged gear spinning beyond controllable speeds. Using stasis to slow a necromorph is a repurposing of something Isaac knew from a previous intact life. Even his survival tactics are second-hand. The kinesis module, the gravitational tether that allows Isaac to lift and throw objects, is similarly an engineer's tool applied to fighting. He can throw debris, canisters, explosive objects from the environment, even severed necromorph limbs back at the creatures that lost them. Kinesis runs on energy that recharges slowly, and that must also be spent opening locked mechanisms, moving crates blocking progress, and solving the environmental problems the Ishimura constantly presents. Every resource Isaac has serves multiple competing purposes simultaneously. Nothing is reserved purely for combat. Survival competes with navigation and repair for the same limited supply, and that calculus never resolves cleanly. This is worth comparing to another horror game that confronts a protagonist with a threat she fundamentally cannot overpower. In Alien Isolation, Amanda Ripley enters Sevastopol Station with almost nothing at all, a motion tracker, eventually a flamethrower with critically limited fuel, and an assortment of improvised devices that can deter the xenomorph but cannot defeat it. The game's central mechanic is avoidance. Running is possible, hiding is possible, misdirection is possible, direct confrontation with the alien is categorically not available. Amanda never has the experience of winning a fight because Dead Space gives Isaac more than Amanda has, and that is precisely what makes his situation more psychologically intricate. He can fight, he can win individual encounters, the plasma cutter works, the stasis module works. He has real tools, real skill in using them, real moments where something goes exactly as intended. In those moments he feels, and you feel with him, genuinely capable. Amanda Ripley never has that feeling. She has just enough to feel like surviving today is an achievement. The horror of Alien Isolation is the horror of absolute powerlessness. The horror of Dead Space is different. It's the horror of believing you have power, building confidence on that belief, then discovering that the frame around your power is contracting. The ammo runs lower than expected. A new enemy type doesn't respond to the strategies you've refined over the last 2 hours. The thing you've gotten effective at defeating has a cousin you've never encountered that comes from an angle you didn't anticipate. The confidence was real in the moment. What surrounds it, quietly and without announcement, is a system that has more variables than you can account for. The variety of necromorphs Isaac encounters demonstrates this more clearly than any single mechanic. The slasher is the most common form, roughly humanoid, fast-moving, with bladed limbs where arms once were. Against a slasher, the dismemberment system feels genuinely empowering. You target the blades, then the legs. You find a rhythm. You feel, for a window of time, like you understand the rules. Then a slasher missing both legs drags itself toward you across the floor, lower to the ground than your trained aim accounts for, faster than it should be without legs because the posture shift has changed its physics. The lurker clings to walls and ceilings, attacking from positions that trained instincts didn't prepare for. The exploder carries a single massively enlarged appendage, dense with volatile tissue, meaning that the reflex to shoot the threatening limb first detonates the creature and catches Isaac in the blast, every correct instinct transformed into a self-inflicted catastrophe. The pregnant variant carries an internal payload of smaller, faster creatures that release upon the host's death, making the act of killing it the act of generating more enemies. The divider separates into 5 independently moving components when destroyed: a single creature becoming 5 simultaneous problems at the moment of apparent victory. The regenerator cannot be killed through dismemberment at all. Severed limbs regrow. Isaac must locate a specific additional resource, something not guaranteed to be nearby, to stop the regeneration permanently. The fundamental mechanic of the game becomes useless against it, and the game offers no warning before the encounter begins. Even death in dead space requires labor. Any necromorph that appears defeated can reanimate from apparent stillness, and the game eventually trains players to stomp every down body to prevent it rising again. The cleanup of a fight is another fight in miniature. Rest is never built into the aftermath of surviving. Each new variant dismantles something Isaac learned from the last. Every time the game grants a method that works, it introduces a condition where that method fails. The feeling of competence the dismemberment system generates is genuine in the moment. It is also temporary by architectural design. There is a strand of psychological research concerned specifically with how people respond to environments where learned strategies are systematically undermined, where what worked before is made to stop working, not randomly, but in a pattern that prevents any stable model from holding. The finding, replicated across many different experimental contexts, is that people in that situation tend to continue trying because trying worked in the past, and the brain anchors to that history. But beneath the continued effort, the background confidence that effort will succeed begins quietly dissolving. The action remains. The certainty behind it gradually empties out. Dead Space is built to produce exactly that erosion. The fear doesn't come primarily from any single creature or any single encounter. It comes from the growing, poorly articulable suspicion that the tools you carry, the strategies you've built, the mastery you've accumulated, all of it is outpaced by a system with more variables than you can account for. You're getting better. The game is also expanding in a direction you can't fully predict. The gap between your improving skill and the accumulating threat never closes, and the game ensures you feel that gap even during your most successful moments. There is one more dimension to the Necromorphs that rarely gets discussed, and it matters for understanding why the game's hopelessness feels as heavy as it does rather than simply difficult. The creatures that populate the Ishimura are not alien invaders that boarded the ship from outside. Every single one of them was, until recently, a person who served on this vessel, an engineer, a medical officer, a security guard, a colonist from Aegis 7 who tried to escape to the ship and brought something with them that nobody anticipated. The infection doesn't replace the human. It reorganizes them. Bones are externalized and sharpened. Joints are rerouted to support different types of movement. Tissue is repurposed for attack rather than comfort. The biological memory of a human shape persists beneath the transformation, and in certain forms, particularly when the fighting slows and you get a clear look, the remnant of recognizable anatomy is still there. Dead Space's designers made a deliberate choice to preserve the human origin of the necromorphs visually. The feet remain feet. The posture in some forms is still upright. The faces, however deformed, still have features arranged in the pattern that a face should have. The game asks you to destroy things that used to be people. It offers no alternative to that task. This is morally different from fighting a creature that arrived from outside the human world. A monster from outside can be hated cleanly, its destruction carrying no weight beyond survival. A necromorph used to have a name, used to eat in the cafeteria somewhere on this ship, used to send messages to family members, used to have the small personal habits that mean nothing to anyone outside the person who has them. Those habits are gone. The name is gone. What remains is something that wants to make more of itself at Isaac's expense. Destroying it remains necessary. The necessity carries a quieter cost than simple combat. This moral weight adds a layer to the helplessness the game constructs that is difficult to name precisely. Isaac is not just surviving. He is moving through the remnants of a community that was destroyed before he arrived, and the things that destroyed it are that community transformed. Every battle is simultaneously survival and erasure. He is completing the annihilation of people who were already victims, for reasons that have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the simple arithmetic of continuing to breathe, doing terrible necessary things inside a system that left no better options. That feeling runs through Dead Space in a way that elevates it above survival horror as a category. And there is a specific reason the system left no better options, a reason built into the Ishimura's mission long before Isaac was sent to repair it. The people who designed that mission knew something about Aegis 7 that they did not share with the crew. The last voyage of the greatest ship humanity ever built was never a mining operation in the sense anyone on board was told. It was a retrieval, a carefully managed crisis with a specific goal, pursued by people who had done the calculations and determined that the cost in human lives was acceptable, provided the prize at the end was large enough. And that is where Dead Space stops being a game about what the monsters do, and starts being a game about what people in positions of authority decided to do with those monsters, and with everyone who got close enough to be used. Chapter 3. The Ishimura as Coffin. The Kellion wasn't supposed to crash. Automated docking systems were a standard feature on ships like the Ishimura, a convenience built into the infrastructure of industrial space travel, designed so that incoming vessels could be guided in without the difficulty of manual docking in deep space. The Kellion engaged those systems as it approached. The clamps extended, the sequence initiated, and then something in the Ishimura's already failing machinery produced a malfunction during the approach, and the shuttle hit the flight deck at the wrong angle and at the wrong speed. The Kellion was destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Isaac didn't land on the Ishimura. He crash-landed on it, and in that single mechanical failure, before a necromorph had reached him, before he'd found a single weapon, before any of the horror had formally introduced itself, the last external means of leaving was gone. Within minutes of arriving, Isaac was given a task. Restore power to this section of the flight deck. Get something operational. The ship was failing, and the only way forward required keeping parts of it running, so he fixed it. He found the access panel, restored the right circuits, and the lights came back on in a corridor that moments before had been dark. Then a necromorph came through the vent on the left. This is the rhythm the game establishes immediately and never abandons. Isaac moves through a broken ship, fixing things, and the act of fixing things allows the ship to continue being the place where he is trapped. He restores tram power and rides the tram to the next area. He repairs atmospheric systems so the air in a damaged wing becomes breathable enough to cross. He reactivates generators, restores power conduits, brings life back to sections of the vessel that the necromorph infestation had shut down. Each repair is genuine progress. Each repair also makes the Ishimura more functional as a structure, more capable of containing him, more fully present as a closed system with Isaac inside it. There's something almost elegant about this as a design choice, and something genuinely disturbing about it as a narrative one. Isaac is doing exactly what an engineer would do. He is applying the skills he has to the problems directly in front of him. The resourcefulness is real. The competence is real. His decisions are his own, and they produce real outcomes. What they don't produce, what they structurally cannot produce in the context the game establishes, is escape. Every improvement he makes to the Ishimura serves the ship more than it serves him. The machine he is maintaining is the machine of his captivity. This mirrors something that happens in a lot of high-demand institutional environments in the real world. People inside a broken system often spend their energy fixing the system's problems without gaining the leverage to change the system itself. The labor is directed inward toward keeping things running, rather than outward toward a condition where the person doing the labor is genuinely safer. The work feels purposeful. The purpose, examined from a distance, turns out to serve the structure rather than the individual. Isaac is the most skilled laborer the Ishimura has ever had. He just happens to be working for something that regards his survival as a secondary concern. Now consider what the Ishimura actually was when he arrived. The ship was 62 years old, commissioned in the mid-24th century in response to a period of catastrophic resource depletion on Earth and its colonies. The Ishimura was the first of its kind, a planet cracker, capable of literally fracturing planetary bodies and extracting the minerals within. Its successful maiden voyage ended a series of violent interstellar conflicts that had erupted over shrinking resource supplies. A ship over a mile in length, carrying a crew numbering into the thousands, it represented, in the clearest possible terms, what humanity could achieve when it organized its engineering ambition at the largest possible scale. For its final mission before decommissioning, the Ishimura was assigned to Aegis 7, publicly, for one last planet-cracking run. The crew understood it as routine. Most of the crew did not know that the mission carried a secondary objective. The ship's captain, Benjamin Mathias, was a devoted member of the Church of Unitology. When a marker was unearthed near the colony on Aegis 7, the Unitologist network that had spread through the Concordance Extraction Corporation arranged for the Ishimura to retrieve it. The corporation provided the ship and the cover story. The religion provided the motivation. The crew provided the labor, without being told what they were actually helping to accomplish. When the marker came aboard, what had already been building in the colony below accelerated on the ship above. The marker's signal was already at work, producing paranoia, hallucinations, the particular kind of psychological deterioration that results from sustained exposure to something built to manipulate living minds. The necromorph infection didn't arrive with the marker as an immediate event. It arrived gradually, through a sequence of decisions and failures that each seemed, in the moment, like a response to an emergency. This is the part of the story worth holding on to, because it's where the trap becomes visible in its full architecture. By the time the infection was widespread, the colonists on Aegis 7 below were trying to escape. They commandeered shuttles, they fled the planet. They were desperate people trying to reach what they assumed was safety, what they could see from the surface as a massive and presumably functional ship. Captain Matthias ordered the Ishimura's mass driver cannons to fire on them. The ADS array, the automated defense system that existed to track and destroy incoming asteroid debris during planet-cracking operations, was directed at human beings in evacuation shuttles. Many of those shuttles were destroyed. Others collided with each other or with the debris fields surrounding the ship from the cracking operation itself. Very few made it through. Among those that did was a shuttle carrying a colonist named Colin Barrow, who brought the infection onto the Ishimura in a form that went undetected until it was far too late. Think about what that order reveals about the logic governing the mission. The captain of a ship carrying thousands of people, watching survivors of a disaster his own decisions helped create, trying to reach safety, used weapons designed to protect the ship from space rocks to destroy evacuation craft carrying those survivors. The instrumental calculation of the situation, the marker must be secured, the mission must be completed, the scope of what was happening must be contained, eliminated every other consideration. The colonists became a variable in an equation where the constant was the objective. They were managed accordingly. This is not the kind of cruelty that requires a monster. It requires only a person who has internalized deeply enough the logic of the institution they serve. A person who has learned to process human lives as manageable problems rather than as ends in themselves. The order followed from his beliefs and his authority with a kind of terrible coherence. Eventually, the ship's situation deteriorated beyond what Matthias could control. He was killed by another crew member aboard the ship, Dr. Terence Kine, under circumstances that the surviving records don't make entirely clear in their specific sequence. What is documented is what Kine did afterward. He disengaged the Ishimura's engines. His intention, as much as it can be reconstructed, was to send the ship burning through Aegis 7's atmosphere, to destroy everything aboard, including the infection, including himself, a kind of extreme containment, an act of destruction disguised as an act of sacrifice. Chief Security Officer Alyssa Vincent tried to stop him. She attempted to restabilize the engines and failed. Before she was lost, she managed to do one thing. She launched a distress signal outward into space, toward whatever might be listening. The escape pods and remaining shuttlecraft on the Ishimura had been jettisoned, launched empty. The specific circumstances of how or why they were emptied before launch are not fully established in the records that survived the incident. What's clear is the outcome. By the time the infection had grown beyond containment, no one inside the ship had anywhere to go. The vessel that was supposed to be a tool of mobility had sealed itself into a container. And then the Kellyan arrived, crashed, and sealed the last door. Now Isaac is inside. Here's what makes the Ishimura different from the ships at the center of most science fiction horror, and why that difference matters for understanding the specific hopelessness Dead Space is built around. Event Horizon, the 1997 film, presents a ship that went somewhere it shouldn't have and returned changed. A crew investigates the returned ship. Something spreads through a confined space in deep space. The comparison to Dead Space gets made often, and the surface similarities are real. But the horror in Event Horizon comes from contact with something genuinely alien. A dimension that operated by different rules, transformed the ship and its crew in ways that no human institution intended or anticipated. The disaster was a consequence of an experiment that produced an outcome nobody imagined, touching something nobody understood. The horror came from outside the recognizable world. Dead Space's horror was arranged. The decisions that put the marker on the Ishimura were made by specific people within recognizable power structures for comprehensible reasons. The Unitologist network within the CEC arranged a mission. A captain executed the mission with the full authority of his rank. The mass driver cannons fired on evacuation craft because someone with the power to give that order gave it. None of these decisions required contact with something alien to corrupt the people making them. They required only the conditions that already existed: a religion with a goal, a corporation with reach, and a human being in a position of authority who had already decided what mattered most. The trap on the Ishimura was assembled by human hands. That is the part of Dead Space that stays with you once you see it clearly. You can be afraid of something alien and unknowable while still believing the human world around it is fundamentally sane. The game takes that comfort away. The ship became what it became through decisions made by accountable people, acting within institutional logics that were recognizable before the marker was ever involved. When Isaac repairs the Ishimura, he is working within a system built by those decisions. When he rides the tram or restores the atmospheric processors or reactivates the power grid, he is navigating the consequences of choices made in boardrooms and religious councils that predated his involvement by years. He didn't build the trap. He was sent into it by people who knew, approximately, what they were sending him toward. And the most specific, devastating layer of that is the reason he came willingly. Someone sent him a message. Someone who mattered to him more than anything else in that ship, in that corporation, in that entire institutional structure. A message that brought him across the void towards something that already knew he was coming. That person was gone before he arrived, and the thing that knew he was coming had been using her image since before he ever left. Chapter 4. Nicole was always dead. Start at the beginning of the game. Chapter 1. New arrivals. The first letter is N. Chapter 2. Intensive care. The first letter is I. Chapter 3. Course correction. The first letter is C. Chapter 4. Obliteration imminent. The first letter is O. Chapter 5. Lethal devotion. The first letter is L. Chapter 6. Environmental hazard. The first letter is E. Chapter 7. Into the void. The first letter is I. Chapter 8. Search and rescue. The first letter is S. Chapter 9. Dead on arrival. The first letter is D. Chapter 10. End of days. The first letter is E. Chapter 11. Alternate solutions. The first letter is A. Chapter 12. Dead space. The first letter is D. Those letters spell out Nicole is dead. The game knew. The game told you. It displayed the answer in the chapter structure before you'd taken your first step, and it was accurate from the beginning to the end. Every moment Isaac spent searching for her, every corridor he pushed through, holding on to the possibility that she was alive somewhere on this ship. Every time the hallucination appeared and seemed to offer some form of connection, all of it was happening inside a truth the game had already announced. You were moving through a space whose architecture had already settled what the ending would reveal. Most people who played Dead Space didn't notice the chapter title message until someone pointed it out. It requires a specific kind of attention, the kind you bring to something after the fact when you're looking for patterns, but the message was never hidden in any meaningful sense. It was printed, plain and clear, at the start of each chapter. The game didn't encrypt it or bury it in lore documents. It put it where anyone looking at the chapter titles in order would find it, and then relied on the fact that most people are focused on what's happening inside the chapters rather than what the titles themselves might be spelling out. This is a specific kind of horror writing. The truth is visible from the beginning. The horror comes from understanding, retrospectively, that every hope you carried through the game was being carried inside a space that already knew the answer. There's a strand of psychological research concerned with how knowledge affects suffering, specifically, how the timing of information shapes what a person experiences. In controlled environments, people who receive difficult news later tend to experience a sharper, more disorienting version of grief than people who receive it earlier, even when the facts themselves are identical. The delayed revelation doesn't reduce the harm, it concentrates it into a moment of rupture, a sudden collapse of the version of reality the person had been inhabiting. The chapter titles of Dead Space are structured to produce exactly that collapse at the game's ending, while having provided the answer the entire time. It's a form of narrative honesty that functions as cruelty. The game didn't lie, it just waited. Now consider why Isaac was on that ship in the first place. Nicole Brennan was uncertain about accepting the medical officer position on the Ishimura. The opportunity was significant. The ship was a prestigious posting, a chance to build a career that would open further doors. But it was also a long deployment, a significant commitment, a decision with real weight. She hesitated. According to the account that survived, Isaac encouraged her to take it. He told her she would regret not going, that she would look back on passing up the opportunity and wish she hadn't. She took the job. This is a small detail in the franchise's broader account of events. Its weight is not small. Every interaction the marker has with Isaac, every hallucination that appears in his mind, every image of Nicole that guides or haunts or accuses him, runs through this fact. The thing the marker uses against him is not a fabrication. The guilt it exploits is not something the marker installed. Isaac carried it in before he ever arrived, as genuinely his own as any part of him. He encouraged her to take a job that put her in the path of something that destroyed her. He sent her there. The marker found that wound, identified it as the most accessible point of leverage on this particular person, and built its entire manipulation of Isaac around it. This is worth examining carefully, because it changes the nature of what the Nicole hallucination actually is. In most horror stories, the haunting is an imposition. Something external forces its way into the protagonist's life and disrupts it. The ghost appears from outside. The monster arrives from elsewhere. Even in psychological horror, the invading element tends to be presented as alien to the person being haunted, something that doesn't belong in their inner world. The Nicole hallucination belongs entirely to Isaac. It's built from his memories of her specific voice, her specific expressions, the specific quality of his feelings for her. The marker didn't create those materials, it located them in his mind and learned how to operate them. The hallucination is accurate enough to be convincing because the source material it's drawing from is genuinely his. Research into how grief shapes vulnerability has found that loss with attached guilt functions as a particular kind of wound, one that stays open in ways that ordinary grief doesn't, because the person experiencing it carries not just the loss itself, but an ongoing internal argument about whether they could have prevented it. That argument is never really resolved without outside help, and it keeps the wound accessible indefinitely. A person inside that kind of grief is susceptible to anything that appears to offer movement toward resolution, even if what's being offered is itself part of the trap. The marker understood this, or was built to understand it, across an evolutionary history of encountering intelligent species and identifying the psychological materials most useful for manipulation. It found in Isaac a person already primed for exactly the kind of control it needed to exercise. A person who loved someone, felt responsible for her fate, and couldn't accept her death without first finding something to do with the guilt. So it gave him something to do. It showed him Nicole. It let her guide him, and where it guided him was directly to the outcome the marker needed. So from his perspective, placing the marker was part of surviving. From the marker's perspective, it was the goal all along. The hallucination of Nicole was directing Isaac toward the marker's agenda from the first moment it appeared. The compass looked like love. It functioned as a leash. Kendra Daniels, the intelligence operative who had been embedded in Isaac's team from the beginning, confirmed at the end of the first game that Nicole had been dead since before Isaac ever arrived, that the message he received, the one that motivated him to come to the Ishimura at all, was sent before the outbreak had been fully understood. By the time Isaac watched that message on his way to the ship, Nicole was already gone. He watched it many times, reportedly, during the approach. He was already grieving on some level before he even knew he was. Dead Space 2 uses Nicole differently, and that change is diagnostic of what the marker needed from Isaac at that point in the story. By the time of the second game, Isaac had been held in an asylum on Titan Station for 2 years. His mind had been harvested. The marker blueprint it carried had been extracted and used to build the Site-12 marker at the Sprawl. He had been kept sedated, his memory suppressed by drugs administered to manage the dementia the marker exposure had caused, while the institution that held him exploited the information his damaged brain contained. He woke up without memory of the past 3 years, in a room covered with marker symbols he had apparently drawn himself, with no reliable sense of how he got there, or what had been done to him. The hallucination of Nicole in Dead Space 2 is violent and hostile in ways the first game's version was not. She screams at him. She attacks him in his own mind. She demands he confront what she represents, what he cannot accept about her death, what he cannot let go. This shift is not random. In the first game, the marker needed Isaac alive, cooperative, and moving. The gentle version of Nicole served that agenda. It kept him functional enough to complete the tasks the marker required. In the second game, the marker's agenda had advanced. The Site-12 marker was built. What it needed now was for Isaac to die at the marker's base, his body completing the convergence cycle. The gentle guidance was no longer useful. What was useful now was breaking him, accelerating his psychological deterioration, making the idea of giving up feel like relief. So the hallucination changes. It becomes what the marker now needs it to be. The most precise thing about this is that the hallucination, even in its hostile form, is still drawn from real material. The accusations it makes touch things Isaac actually carries. The way it weaponizes his guilt is effective because the guilt is real. The marker didn't fabricate a wound to exploit. It diagnosed the wound Isaac already had and applied pressure to it over time, first gently, then with increasing force, tracking what was necessary to produce the outcome it needed. There is a detail from the remake of Dead Space 1 that adds a layer to this that doesn't appear in the original. In a text log accessible in the later stages of the game, Nicole is shown in a conversation with a hallucination of her own, one that takes the form of Isaac's deceased mother, Octavia. The entity speaking through Octavia's image speaks to Nicole in the hours before Nicole ends her life. Nicole recognizes the manipulation. She knows she's being reached. She tries to make it stop. The detail that matters here is not just what the hallucination says, but what its form reveals. The marker had access to Isaac's history well before it had access to Isaac. It knew who his mother was. It knew the specific people in his life, the relationships and losses that constituted him as a person. It reached into Nicole's situation through a figure drawn from Isaac's world. The process that would later use Nicole's image to control Isaac was, at this earlier moment, already using someone else from Isaac's life as a point of contact with Nicole herself. The trap was not assembled at the moment Isaac arrived on the Ishimura. The hooks were already placed in people he loved before he ever received the message that brought him there. This is the quality of Dead Space's hopelessness that separates it from most horror experiences. The dread doesn't arise from being physically overpowered or outmatched, though those things are also true. It arises from the gradual recognition that the things you thought were entirely your own, your memories, your love, your specific grief for a specific person, were legible to something that treated them as raw material. That something understood them well enough to use them before the story you thought you were in had even begun. Isaac survived the Ishimura. He survived the sprawl. Both times, by enormous effort and at enormous cost, he found ways to destroy the marker that was running the particular version of the trap he was inside. Both times, the hallucination of Nicole was what kept him moving, first toward the marker's goal, then, in the second game, away from it, when he finally confronted what the hallucination actually was and fought through the marker's last attempt to use his grief to complete convergence. But neither survival resolved the fundamental condition he was in. The marker blueprint remained in his mind. EarthGov had spent 3 years using it. Unitology wanted it. Other markers had been built from it, spreading to colonies across human space. The outcome of Isaac surviving wasn't that the threat ended. The outcome was that he remained, as he had always been, a resource with legs, someone whose mind contained something valuable to institutions large enough to reach him wherever he went. Those institutions, and the specific way they shaped the world that made Isaac's story possible, are the subject of what comes next. Because the Ishimura didn't send itself to Aegis 7, the marker didn't spread without help. The conditions that put Isaac in that corridor, alone, with no memory of what had been done to him during 3 years of institutional captivity, those conditions were built by people with organizations behind them, with funding, with ideological conviction, and with a very clear sense of what the marker was worth, and what they were willing to spend to get it. When you see what those people built, and how long they'd been building it, the corridor Isaac wakes up in at the start of Dead Space 2 looks different. The straitjacket looks different. The room full of marker symbols he apparently drew himself while medicated and unconscious looks different. The most frightening part of Dead Space was never the monsters. Chapter 5. The Church That Built the End. On the Ishimura's crew deck, Isaac finds bodies, not bodies that were attacked, not bodies that were converted against their will or overwhelmed in a corridor while running from something. These bodies are arranged, people who came together in a room and chose, collectively, to end their lives in the belief that what came next would be better than what they were leaving behind. They were Unitologists, and the specific horror of finding them is that the choice wasn't made in panic or confusion. It was made in faith. Understanding how a person arrives at that choice requires going back to the beginning of Unitology, to its founding story. More specifically, it requires understanding the distance between that founding story and what actually happened. Michael Altman was a marine geologist. He was part of the team that worked near the discovery of the Black Marker, an alien artifact uncovered in the Yucatan region of Earth. The marker produced an electromagnetic signal that nobody on the research team fully understood. His colleagues experienced the same paranoia and hallucinations the marker signal reliably produces in people who spend sustained time near it. For reasons that haven't been documented clearly, Altman showed more resistance to those effects than the others on his team. He concluded the marker was dangerous. He tried to stop the institutional effort to use it as an energy source. During one necromorph outbreak triggered by the marker's signal, he managed to reverse engineer the marker's code well enough to calm the signal and stop the immediate crisis. He then destroyed the research facility, hoping to end the program by eliminating its location. He was killed shortly after by 2 military officers who had been overseeing the Black Marker facility. The Unitologist account of his death is different. The version the church teaches says he was killed by the government for exposing the marker to the public, that he was a martyr who gave his life rather than allow authorities to suppress knowledge of something sacred. The account made Altman into a prophet, a figure who faced the establishment and lost because he was ahead of his time, because what he found was too important for the people in power to allow into the open. That account is a fabrication. The people who killed Altman were the same people who ran the facility he had destroyed. They created the Church of Unitology using Altman's name and the public attention his earlier leak had generated, and then used that church to generate money from the people who believed in it. They built a religion around a man who spent his final days trying to stop exactly what the religion was designed to accomplish. This is the crack at the base of the entire structure. Unitology's founding prophet actively opposed the thing Unitology worships. The faith was constructed by people who understood the marker's true nature and chose to monetize the gap between that truth and the story they told. The Church of Unitology was an enterprise before it was a religion. Here's what makes that founding lie so effective at scale, and why it matters for understanding what the church became. The lie works because the need it addresses is genuine. People join Unitology because of what they're promised, which is the same thing every serious faith community promises in different language. That death is not the end, that the people you've lost are somewhere you can eventually reach, that existence has a direction, and that direction is toward something rather than nothing. In the 26th century, in a civilization that has consumed multiple planets' worth of resources and expanded across the solar system, mostly out of desperation, that promise lands particularly hard. The resource crises, the institutional corruption, the sense that the systems governing daily life are neither just nor interested in being just. All of this creates an enormous appetite for something that offers a different frame for what human life is for. Research into why people join high-demand religious groups has found consistently that the entry-level experience rarely reflects the deepest beliefs of the organization. What brings people in is warmth, community, a sense of being seen and welcomed. What they encounter at that level is real enough to be convincing. The concerning elements are structured deeper, behind additional commitments, visible only to members who have demonstrated sufficient investment to be trusted with more. The gradual reveal is part of the design. Unitology uses this structure explicitly. Public messaging emphasizes harmony, environmental concern, the possibility of reunion and transcendence. These elements are not entirely insincere, particularly for members who never reach the inner levels of the church. The community experience they have is genuinely a community experience. The faith they practice is a real expression of what they believe. The church didn't sell them something false in an obvious way. It sold them something true at the level they could see, and withheld what was behind it until they were too committed to the community to easily leave. The deeper teachings concern the convergence, and convergence, understood fully, means the biological end of every individual who experiences it, absorbed into a planetary-scale necromorph organism that the Brethren Moons will collect as part of their own expansion. The version of eternal life that Unitology promises and the version that the marker actually delivers are different enough that describing them with the same word requires either willful ignorance or active deception. The higher levels of the church know this. The question of what they believe about it, whether they genuinely think the convergence is good in ways that the conventional view misses, or whether they have simply decided the acquisition of institutional power is worth the cost, is one the franchise never resolves cleanly. What's clear is what they do. They manipulate members into deeper commitment. They suppress doubts and manage dissenters. They maintain the gap between public doctrine and internal reality with enough discipline that the vast majority of Unitologists are genuinely sincere in their belief, making them more convincing ambassadors for the faith than they would be if they knew what the faith was actually working toward. Dr. Chalice Mercer, aboard the Ishimura, represents one of the cases where the inner understanding was reached, and the response to that understanding was commitment rather than rejection. He believed in the marker's mission with enough conviction to actively assist the Necromorphs rather than fight them. He understood that what was happening aboard the ship was the process the church had prepared its members for, not through the gentle community building of the lower levels, but through the actual mechanism of transformation that the marker carried out on human bodies. Whether Mercer's version of faith was more consistent than the version practiced by the Unitologist who chose death on the crew deck is not clear from the available accounts. He was wrong about what the convergence would actually produce. The marker does not deliver the eternal communion it promises in the Church's language. But he had at least stopped dressing the process in comfortable language. He believed in the mechanism itself. The most committed people in the Church's history have always had this quality. The gap between what the marker offers and what Unitology promises narrows, for them, because they have defined the marker's reality as the correct version of what the promise meant. This is the part of Dead Space that a straightforward villain analysis misses. Unitology's most dangerous members are not people who chose the marker knowing it would kill them for reasons that don't matter to them. They are people who arrived at a genuine conviction that what the marker does is, in some framework that makes sense to them internally, good. The horror of that is different from the horror of simple malice. Simple malice you can position yourself against. A sincere conviction that mass transformation into necromorphs is the fulfillment of something sacred is harder to reason with, harder to negotiate around, and significantly harder to stop. By the time of Dead Space 3, a man named Jacob Danick led a group called The Circle, a radical offshoot of the main church that had grown impatient with the gradual approach. EarthGov had industrialized marker production, turning what the Circle considered sacred into a manufacturing program. The Circle's response was to begin activating markers across human colonies, triggering outbreaks on a broad scale to accelerate the convergence they believed was coming regardless. The Circle was not a corruption of Unitologist belief. It was Unitologist belief pursued without patience. The mainstream church wanted convergence. The Circle simply wanted it faster, and saw EarthGov's industrialization of the markers as both a violation and, inadvertently, an opportunity. More markers meant more potential convergence events. The Circle intended to use that. What the mainstream church knew and managed carefully was that moving too fast created exactly the kind of horror that made recruitment difficult. The Circle had stopped caring about recruitment. They had enough people. They wanted the end. If you've been thinking so far about who the most dangerous people in Dead Space's world actually are, the answer is not the Necromorphs. It's not even the marker. It's the people who understand what the marker does, who've seen what the process produces, and who choose to pursue it anyway because they've constructed a framework in which that outcome is the correct one. That framework required a world that had already failed the people inside it in specific and measurable ways. Understanding that world requires understanding the other institution at the center of it, the one that was not selling transcendence, that offered no comforting doctrine about death and transformation, that simply regarded the marker as a resource and the people near it as additional resources to be managed accordingly. EarthGov did not offer its subjects eternity. It offered them the experience of being used efficiently. Chapter 6. EarthGov's Necessary Sacrifice. Isaac wakes up in a padded room at the start of Dead Space 2. He is in a straitjacket. The walls are covered in symbols. He apparently drew them himself, in layers over some period of time he has no memory of. A man named Franco DeLille opens his cell door and is killed by a necromorph within seconds of arriving. Isaac has no weapons, no suit, no clear sense of where he is or how long he has been there. 3 years have passed since the Ishimura. Everything that happened to Isaac in those 3 years was done to him by EarthGov. The asylum was an EarthGov facility. The memory-suppressing drugs were administered by EarthGov's medical staff, following EarthGov's protocols. The process that extracted the marker blueprint from Isaac's mind and used it to build the Site-12 marker on Titan Station was run by EarthGov's director of the Sprawl, Hans Tiedemann. Nolan Strauss went through a similar process. Both men were kept functional but not well, managed but not treated, preserved for the information their damaged minds contained, rather than for any concern about their experience of being preserved. When Tiedemann said Isaac's mind was the purest for the marker program, he was using the word pure in an institutional sense. He meant that Isaac's contact with the red marker had produced the clearest, most replicable mental blueprint of any survivor they had found. He meant Isaac was the best raw material for what EarthGov needed to build. This is the word that does the most work in Dead Space 2's portrait of EarthGov. Raw material. EarthGov's relationship to the marker was always structured around potential use. The original Black Marker research program was motivated by energy. The marker appeared to generate power from no apparent source, and humanity in the 26th century was running out of planet-based resources fast enough that the appeal of limitless energy overcame the documented dangers of being near the thing that generated it. The government knew the marker caused dementia, hallucinations, and necromorph outbreaks in populations near it. The research program continued anyway because the potential output, if the marker could be controlled and understood, was large enough to justify the cost. The cost was always paid by someone other than the people making the calculation. Kendra Daniels was placed on the Kellyan before it left for the Ishimura. She was an EarthGov intelligence operative embedded in what was publicly a CEC rescue mission. Her actual instructions were to retrieve the red marker from the Ishimura and secure it for EarthGov before Unitology could get to it. She spent the entire first game operating as a member of the rescue team while pursuing a separate agenda. She used Isaac when using him advanced her objective. She attempted to betray him at the moment she could accomplish what she had come for. The Necromorphs killed her before she could leave Aegis 7. What Kendra's embedded presence confirms is that EarthGov knew before the Kellyan arrived that the Ishimura mission was not what the crew believed it was. The government had intelligence on the Unitologist network within the CEC, on the marker's retrieval as the mission's true objective, and on the outbreak that had resulted. They sent an operative rather than a rescue team because they weren't primarily interested in rescuing the crew. They were interested in the marker. This matters for understanding Isaac's position across both games, because it means he was never in a situation where the institutions around him were working toward his survival as a primary goal. In the first game, his survival was useful because he was the tool available for navigating the Ishimura, and, ultimately, for returning the marker to its pedestal in a way that served the marker's agenda while appearing to serve his escape. In the second game, his survival was useful because his mind contained something EarthGov needed to build. The moment his usefulness in either context ended, the calculus shifted. Cheetahman ordered Isaac killed when the outbreak started, and Isaac was no longer in EarthGov's custody. The resource, once it was no longer controllable, became a liability. The government also falsified the public account of what happened on the Ishimura. Whatever version of the disaster reached the general population was not the truth. EarthGov classified the details, controlled the narrative, and ensured that the specific nature of what the marker had done to the Ishimura's crew was not part of public knowledge. Workers on stations like the Sprawl, living in proximity to marker research installations without knowing those installations existed, had no way to assess the risk they were being exposed to. This is a quieter kind of harm than anything the Necromorphs produce, but it's worth sitting with. The people who bore the consequences of EarthGov's marker research program were, systematically, people who had not been given the information needed to consent to those consequences. The government made decisions about acceptable risk and managed the information environment to ensure that acceptable risk remained a judgment made by the institution rather than by the individuals who lived inside it. Research into how institutions handle information about risk has found that the gap between what an organization knows and what it tells the people affected by its decisions is often not the result of active malice. It is often the result of structures that treat information as a resource to be managed, rather than as something people have a right to. The people running EarthGov's marker program probably believed, at the level where they had to believe something to keep working, that they were acting in humanity's best long-term interest. The short-term cost to specific individuals was a line item in a calculation, where the potential benefit was the survival of the species. That is precisely the logic that makes it so difficult to interrupt from within. It's not a logic built on hatred of the people being harmed. It's a logic built on a sufficiently abstract picture of the future that the people being harmed become part of the background. Isaac was part of the background for 3 years. The drugs that managed his dementia also blocked his access to the memories of what had been done to him. This was not an accidental side effect of the treatment. Managing his memory was part of the protocol. A patient who could remember 3 years of having his mind systematically harvested for institutional purposes would not be a cooperative patient. A patient who woke up each day with no clear sense of what had happened the day before could be kept in the program without the complications of informed refusal. By the time the outbreak started on the sprawl and Isaac needed to make decisions, he was operating without any of the context that would have told him who his captors were, what they had done to him, or why the necromorph outbreak he was now being hunted through was directly connected to the research program he had unknowingly contributed to. He was managing a situation without the information that would have allowed him to understand the situation. Again, both EarthGov and Unitology had a use for Isaac. EarthGov wanted the marker blueprint in his mind. Unitology wanted the same thing, for different reasons, toward the same eventual outcome. When the outbreak on the sprawl created chaos, Unitology used it as cover to send an operative named Dana Le Guin to reach Isaac. She presented herself as someone who could help him, someone who knew what was wrong with him, who had access to a cure for the dementia that was, she said, killing him. She guided him through the early sections of the game toward a supposed extraction. When Isaac reached her, she revealed what she actually was and what she actually wanted. EarthGov forces destroyed her ship before she could accomplish the extraction, which was either an act of institutional self-interest or a coincidental intervention, the specific intent behind it not being fully established in the accounts that survived. What's clear is the pattern. Both institutions located Isaac as a resource. Both constructed a false frame around their interest in him. Both would have disposed of whatever remained of him once they had what they needed. The conflict between EarthGov and Unitology in the Dead Space universe is a conflict between two organizations that regard human beings as instruments in a larger project, with the marker as the fulcrum around which their competing interests turn. Isaac survived both of them by refusing, eventually and at great cost, to complete the function either institution had designed for him. He destroyed the Site-12 marker rather than allowing convergence to complete. He escaped the sprawl rather than being captured by either side. These were genuine acts of agency. They were also acts that left him in a world where the institutions that had built the trap around him were still operating, still holding markers, still running programs that would eventually catch up with whatever new location he tried to disappear into. The franchise doesn't pretend this resolves cleanly. Isaac, at the end of Dead Space 2, is free in a narrow sense and still hunted in a broader one. His mind still contains what both sides want. The world that produced his situation hasn't changed because he survived. The markers were already spreading to other colonies. EarthGov's replication program had distributed the problem far beyond any single station's ability to contain it. He escaped the institutions. He remained inside the world the institutions built. There's a specific kind of helplessness in that position that the game doesn't labor to explain, but that sits underneath everything Dead Space 3 eventually has to reckon with. Isaac is genuinely skilled. His survival is a real achievement. Nothing that happened to him was inevitable in the moment-to-moment sense. But the scale of what surrounds him, the breadth of the institutional failures and decisions and cover-ups that built the conditions he's fighting inside, makes individual survival a local victory in a war operating at a completely different order of magnitude. This is where the series' true thesis begins to come into focus. The hopelessness of Dead Space is not the hopelessness of a man who cannot fight. Isaac fights, constantly with considerable skill. The hopelessness is the hopelessness of scale, of discovering that the frame around your life was built by forces larger than you, that those forces had already made the decisions that shaped your situation before you knew the situation existed, and that surviving your immediate crisis leaves you inside a system that has already prepared the next one. Before the game can arrive at what that scale actually looks like, before the cosmic scale of what the markers are building toward becomes fully visible, it has to show us something happening inside Isaac that neither EarthGov nor Unitology fully understood. Something the drugs managed but could not stop. Something that changes the nature of everything we've been discussing about control and agency and who gets to make decisions. The marker's influence on Isaac's mind is not just a side effect of proximity, it's a process. And the process follows a pattern that researchers who study the relationship between environment and human behavior have documented in contexts that have nothing to do with alien artifacts or science fiction horror. The pattern is learned helplessness, and it operates on a level that institutions can exploit but cannot manufacture, because it comes from the person being damaged rather than from the institution doing the damage. That's where we're going in the next section, into the psychology of how a person becomes convinced, over time, that their choices don't matter, and why that specific psychological condition is the most important thing the marker needs to work. Chapter 7. The Learned Helplessness Machine. At a certain point in the first Dead Space, Isaac encounters a necromorph that cannot be killed. The hunter, as the creature is designated, regenerates. Sever an arm and the limb regrows within seconds. Remove both legs and they return. Everything Isaac has learned about strategic dismemberment, everything the game spent hours building into his muscle memory and yours, stops working. The one rule that has kept him alive, the foundational logic the game offered as a lifeline in the first minutes of the experience, is simply cancelled. The creature keeps coming. It keeps coming and it keeps coming, and the only solution the game eventually provides is one that has nothing to do with dismemberment at all. Isaac has to trap the hunter in a shuttle's engine exhaust and burn it. The method he was given doesn't work. He has to find a completely different method, using the environment rather than any weapon he's been carrying. And then the game keeps going, because defeating the hunter doesn't mean the rule about dismemberment being reliable is restored. It means that one specific exception was handled. The next exception is already waiting somewhere ahead. This is the moment where Dead Space reveals something about itself that goes beyond horror mechanics. There's a strand of psychological research concerned with what happens when a person or an animal is placed in an environment where their actions reliably fail to change their situation for the better. The research began with animal subjects, but extended across decades into human behavior, and the finding is consistent across both. Prior exposure to uncontrollable negative conditions doesn't just create frustration or discomfort. Over time, it changes how the person or animal approaches future situations, even situations where control is genuinely possible. The expectation that action won't matter becomes the operating assumption. The person stops trying, not because they've made a conscious decision to give up, but because the expectation of failure has become the default setting their behavior runs on. Think of it this way: a person learning to navigate an unfamiliar building finds that every door they try on the right side is locked. They adapt, go left. The left path works for a while. Then a left door locks too. They find a window. The window closes. The building offers no reliable rule. Each time a strategy is developed and applied, the environment adjusts. After enough of this, the person stops looking for exits at all. Not because exits don't exist, but because the accumulated record of searching makes finding one feel like a fantasy rather than a realistic possibility. Dead Space is that building. The strategic dismemberment system builds competence. The hunter cancels it. The hunter, encountered again in later sections, forces the same process again, developing a method that works, discovering a specific enemy type where the method fails, finding another approach at significant cost, then encountering a new challenge where that approach also falls short. The game cycles through this pattern often enough that the confidence it initially generates cannot hold its shape. It cracks under the pressure of repeated exception. Research into how this cycle affects cognitive function has found something important and deeply applicable to Dead Space's design. When people are operating under conditions of resource scarcity, combined with strategy invalidation, the part of the mind that handles longer-term planning and abstract reasoning gets crowded out by the part that handles immediate threat response. You stop thinking about the bigger picture, because the immediate problem is loud enough to fill your whole field of attention. This is not a failure of intelligence or willpower. It is a feature of how human attention works under sustained pressure. Dead Space creates these conditions deliberately. The ammo scarcity keeps you focused on the next room rather than the larger situation. The strategy invalidation keeps you rebuilding your approach from scratch at irregular intervals. The save station placement controls exactly how much accumulated tension you're carrying between opportunities to breathe. Every one of these systems is tuned to keep the player's attention locked at the immediate level, unable to step back and see the shape of what's happening to them. This is what the marker does to Isaac. At a structural level, it runs the same operation. The marker's influence on a person's mind works through a patient process. Early exposure produces whispers, visual disturbances, the beginning of paranoia. People near a marker for extended periods start to have trouble trusting their perceptions. The hallucinations, when they begin, are shaped from the victim's own memories, which means they look real in a way that externally generated visions don't. The mind's defenses against deception are built to recognize things that don't belong. A hallucination built from your own experiences bypasses those defenses because it uses material the mind already accepts as real. The marker's approach to human psychology is like water finding its way through stone. It finds the cracks that are already there. It applies patience. Given enough time, the stone changes around it. When a person resists the hallucinations, they don't weaken. Resistance produces escalation. The visions become more aggressive, more confrontational, more specifically targeted at the things the person cannot afford to lose. The marker appears to understand that attempting to force compliance too early produces exactly the kind of active opposition that might derail its agenda. A gradual, sustained undermining is more effective than a direct assault on someone's sense of reality, because the gradual version leaves the victim still functioning, still capable of doing what the marker needs done, while being oriented progressively more toward the marker's goals. The marker keeps its useful people alive. It simply makes them less and less capable of choosing their own direction. For people whose psychological makeup doesn't suit the marker's current needs, dementia escalates faster and pushes toward paranoia and violence against those around them. For people whose minds have been imprinted with the marker's blueprint, the process is managed differently. The marker needs those people functional enough to build, and the hallucinations guide rather than destroy. The management of the hallucinations for this group becomes a form of ongoing psychological control, so subtle in the early stages that the person being controlled cannot distinguish between their own thoughts and the ones being produced by the marker's signal. When that signal is strong enough, it can pull the victim into what has been described in survivor accounts as a kind of waking coma, a mental state where the physical body is still present, but the consciousness is somewhere else entirely, placed inside a constructed environment built from the victim's memories, populated with versions of the people they've lost. Some of the people who came out of the sprawl described it as a location that looked and felt like home, a place full of the specifics that make a life recognizable, but wrong in a way that became clear only gradually, the wrongness emerging from details that didn't quite align with what the real world contained. It is not coincidental that this is also what EarthGov produced, physically and institutionally, over 3 years. Isaac was designated Patient 4 in EarthGov's Project Helomere. The program studied marker survivors whose minds carried the marker's imprinted blueprint. Those subjects were placed in sessions with the Noonlight Diagnostics Machine, a device that accessed the marker-influenced regions of the brain through the eye socket, using it as an entry point to stimulate and extract the marker's encoded patterns. After each session, memory suppressants were administered. The drugs erased the subject's recollection of the session. The next session began from a cleared starting point, the patient unaware of what had already been taken from them. This is institutional helplessness in its most precise form. The foundation of a person's ability to act in their own interest is their access to their own history. Knowing what has happened to you, what was done by whom, what choices you made and what choices were made for you, forms the ground from which any meaningful decision can be made. EarthGov's protocol stripped that ground away systematically. Isaac didn't just lose 3 years of experience. He lost 3 years of knowledge about what had been done to his mind, who had done it, and what they had built from what they took. He woke up in a room full of marker symbols, with no memory of having drawn them. Here is what's worth sitting with carefully before we move forward, because this next part changes the texture of everything in the second game. The markers system and EarthGov system produced the same condition by different methods. Both left Isaac without reliable access to his own history. Both oriented him toward an agenda that wasn't his own. Both maintained his functional capacity while reducing his ability to understand or resist what was happening to him. The marker used hallucinations and patient psychological pressure. EarthGov used drugs and institutional authority. The result in both cases was a man who could move and act and fight, but who was doing so without full access to the context that would allow those actions to be genuinely self-directed. His competence remained intact. The framework within which that competence was operating was not his own. This is what Dead Space is about at its deepest level. The most sophisticated horror the series constructs is the horror of discovering that the things you believed were authentically yours, your decisions, your motivations, your sense of what you're fighting for, were being managed by forces you weren't aware of, from inside experiences you couldn't fully access. Understanding what that looks like when it's fully operational requires going to the sprawl, to the specific kind of horror that Dead Space 2 builds in the space where the first game used the Ishimura. Because the sprawl looks different from the Ishimura, and that difference is the point. The Ishimura was a warning. The sprawl looked like home. Chapter 8: Dead Space 2 and the Interior War. Isaac Clarke wakes up in a padded room. The walls are covered in symbols. He drew them himself, apparently, over some period of time that he has no memory of. His arms are pinned in a straitjacket. A man named Franco DeLille is opening his cell door to free him. Before Franco can finish the task, he is transformed into a necromorph. 3 years have passed since the Ishimura. 3 years that Isaac cannot remember because the drugs in his system made sure he couldn't. He doesn't know where he is, what was done to him during those years, or what is happening to the station around him. He escapes the mental ward with his arms still bound, navigating through an outbreak that has already begun consuming the population of the Sprawl. The Sprawl is a city station built into the remains of Titan, one of Saturn's moons, which was hollowed out by a planet-cracking operation. The station is enormous and populated. Residential areas, commercial zones, a Unitology resource center, a shopping district. It has the visual language of a place people live in and raise families in, a place that was ordinary before the outbreak started. Walking through it while necromorphs move through the corridors produces a different quality of horror than the Ishimura ever could. The Ishimura was already wrong before Isaac arrived. It was dark, worn, industrial, a place that had already shed the pretense of safety. The Sprawl looked like civilization. The horror of Dead Space 2 is the horror of watching familiar spaces unmake themselves, of finding the necromorphs not in the abandoned corridors of a failing ship, but in shopping areas and children's spaces and residential hallways. The ordinariness of the setting before the infection reached it makes the infection harder to hold at a distance. Something that happens in a ruin feels contained. Something that happens in a city feels like a template for what could happen anywhere. The marker made it happen here specifically because here is where the research was. The Site-12 marker, built from the blueprints extracted from Isaac's mind and Nolan Strauss's mind through Project Telomere, was housed in the Sprawl's government sector. The city grew around an installation whose purpose the vast majority of residents had no knowledge of. The people who lived and worked and raised their children in the Sprawl's commercial and residential sectors were not told they were living adjacent to a working marker. The risk they were being exposed to was not part of any information they had access to. This is the same condition that produced the Ishimura disaster, relocated to a more visible, more civilian, more consequential scale. Nolan Strauss was patient zero in Project Telomere. He went through what Isaac went through. He came out of it different, and the difference between Isaac and Strauss at the start of Dead Space 2 is the most important thing the second game uses to say something about what marker exposure actually does across different people and different levels of prior trauma. Strauss's history with the marker was different from Isaac's. Before being brought to the sprawl, Strauss had come into contact with a marker fragment during a mission aboard a ship called the USG Ishimura. Under the marker's influence, he killed his wife and child. He did not know, in the moment, that they were his wife and child. The marker's hold on his mind made him see something else. When it released him, he was left with the knowledge of what his hands had done. The hallucinations that haunted Strauss on the sprawl were of his dead wife and child, demanding answers, asking why. The marker used material that was real, specific, and irreparable, and it used that material in a way that did not allow for resolution. Where Isaac's hallucination of Nicole could be managed imperfectly as long as he kept moving, Strauss's hallucinations were designed to trap him in a loop. Step 3 of whatever mental process the marker had given him access to required going through a machine that would put a needle into the brain through the eye socket. He became obsessed with making Isaac and Ellie go through this step, trying to force them to experience what he had experienced, to somehow share the weight of what he was carrying. He attacked Ellie. He removed her eye with a screwdriver in an attempt to force her into step 3. He was eventually killed by Isaac. Strauss represents what Isaac does not become, and the gap between them is not a matter of strength or resilience in any simple sense. Isaac's ability to hold on longer than Strauss came from the specific way the marker had chosen to manage him, keeping him functional, keeping the Nicole hallucination navigable enough to preserve his usefulness. Strauss had been pushed differently. His specific guilt, his specific loss, his specific inability to reconcile what the marker had made him do, produced a progression toward breakdown that could not be stabilized by the same techniques the marker used on Isaac. Both men were used. One lasted longer before the use became total. John Carpenter's 1982 film The Thing presents a threat that works by occupation rather than confrontation. Something gets inside. It uses what it finds there. From the outside, nothing appears to have changed. The horror is the uncertainty about what has already been replaced, who can still be trusted, and whether your own perceptions are giving you accurate information about the world in front of you. Dead Space 2 runs a version of that horror at the interior level. The question is not which person around you has been changed. The question is what in your own mind can still be trusted. Isaac almost stabbed his own eye out during one of the dementia sequences on the sprawl. He stopped himself, or rather, the game stops the player from completing the action if they survive the sequence. But the near miss reveals something important about the state he was in. The marker's influence on his brain had progressed to the point where his body was being directed towards self-destruction without his full conscious awareness. He was fighting necromorphs in the corridors, maintaining enough coherence to navigate and make decisions, and simultaneously losing control of his own hands during the moments when the dementia surged. The battlefield was both outside and inside at the same time. This is where Dead Space 2 makes its most specific argument about the nature of control in this universe. The first game could be understood, with effort, as a man against an environment. The environment was hostile, the odds were terrible, but the threat was external. External threats can be engaged with external tools. The plasma cutter works against slashers in corridors. It does nothing against a hallucination projecting itself from inside your own brain, using your own most painful memories as its script. Dead Space 2 removes the one category of problem the player was developing genuine skill at solving. There is a necromorph on the sprawl called the Ubermorph that functions the way the hunter did on the Ishimura. It regenerates. It pursues Isaac through the final sections of the game's approach to the marker site. The strategic dismemberment system, by this point well developed in the player's hands, is useless against it. The Ubermorph can only be avoided, not stopped, and even avoidance is temporary. It keeps coming. It keeps following. It is an inescapable presence in the background of the game's final act, which is itself an inescapable presence in the background of Isaac's psychological crisis as he moves toward the marker. The combination of the external pursuit and the internal hallucination in the game's final section produces something that no individual element could produce on its own. You are running from something that cannot be defeated by the skills you have, while also trying to maintain enough psychological coherence to make decisions about a threat that lives inside the framework you use to make all decisions. The Ubermorph cannot be beaten. The marker cannot be confronted with a weapon, and both of them are pressing simultaneously from opposite directions. Isaac moves through the government sector. He confronts Tiedemann. He reaches the Site 12 marker, and then the marker pulls him inside his own mind. What happens there is the most narratively significant moment in Dead Space 2, and the one that matters most for everything we've been discussing about control, agency, and the nature of the hopelessness this franchise builds. Inside his mind, Isaac faces the Nicole hallucination directly. Not in a corridor, not during a moment of sensory crisis, not while he's also managing an external threat. In the interior space the marker constructs, there is only Isaac and the thing the marker built from his memory of Nicole. The hallucination reveals what it has always been working toward, that the makers of a marker must be absorbed to complete convergence, that the goal was always Isaac's death at the marker's base. The only way out is a fight Isaac cannot win with any physical tool. He has to acknowledge, completely and without the protective fiction of hope, that Nicole is gone, that the thing speaking to him is a construct, that his love and his guilt, real as they are, were the raw material the marker selected and used, and that holding on to them in the form the marker provided is the mechanism of his destruction rather than his survival. Research into how grief shapes behavior under sustained pressure has found something that applies precisely here. When a person carries a loss that is also threaded with guilt, the guilt creates a kind of ongoing psychological obligation. It keeps the loss present not just as sadness, but as an unresolved problem that demands a solution. People in that state are drawn to anything that appears to offer resolution, including things that are harmful, because the weight of the unresolved state is heavy enough to override other forms of judgment. The marker found that weight in Isaac on the first day he arrived on the Ishimura. It managed that weight for 2 games, providing just enough appearance of resolution to keep him functional, while never letting the actual resolution happen, because the actual resolution required acknowledging something the marker needed him to keep refusing. When Isaac finally stops refusing, the marker loses the lever it had been using. The hallucination becomes violent in its final form, dropping the pretense of Nicole and showing what the marker actually needed from him. He fights back. He destroys the projection. The Site 12 marker goes dead. The sprawl is collapsing. Ellie crashes a gunship through the ceiling to reach him. They escape. This is the franchise's one moment where the horror is resolved through psychological clarity rather than physical force. Every other victory Isaac achieves is won with the plasma cutter, with the stasis module, with the engineering tools repurposed into weapons. This one is won by letting himself understand something fully that he had been protecting himself from understanding. The clarity is what kills the marker. The refusal to maintain the fiction is what breaks the control. And here is why that ending matters for what comes next, because it also clarifies the specific kind of hopelessness that the third game has to deal with. Isaac won on the sprawl. He destroyed a marker the size of a building. He did it by achieving a kind of psychological clarity that the marker spent 2 games preventing. That is a genuine victory, real by any measure. What he is about to discover is that the scale of what the markers are part of makes the sprawl look like a single sentence in a much longer document. Everything the Church of Unitology was working toward, everything EarthGov was attempting to harness, all of the human institutional activity around the markers amounts to a footnote in a process that has been running since before humanity existed, and that will continue running long after humanity is gone. That process has a name. It has a visible shape if you know where to look. And the first time Isaac and the people around him see that shape clearly, the word hopeless acquires a dimension it didn't have before. What that shape is, what it means for everything we've discussed, and why it transforms the franchise's central question from personal to cosmic, that's where we're going next. Chapter 9. Convergence, Horror at Scale. Deep beneath the frozen surface of Tau Volantis, At the end of a chain of evidence that took 3 games to follow, Dead Space reveals what the markers actually are. They are messages sent by something much older than humanity. Recruitment signals. Instructions beamed across interstellar distances by entities that have been running this same process on every intelligent civilization they could reach, for longer than human civilization has existed. The markers don't just cause necromorph outbreaks. They are the first stage of a biological assembly line operating at a cosmic scale. And the product at the end of that line is something called a brethren moon. A brethren moon is what a convergence event produces when it completes fully. When enough necromorph biomass has been gathered near a marker, the artifact triggers a vortex that draws organic matter skyward, compressing and fusing it into a single colossal entity, planet-sized, spacefaring, composed of the accumulated biological material of every living thing on the world where it formed. The civilization that built the marker, or encountered it, or was manipulated into replicating it, all of that intelligence and biology and culture and history becomes structural material in something that has no use for any of it except as mass. Each brethren moon that forms joins a network. They communicate via the marker signal, coordinating across interstellar distances, collectively managing the ongoing process of locating new civilizations and initiating the cycle again. The markers being sent to new worlds are not random artifacts or geological anomalies. They are instruments, outputs of a network that has been expanding itself outward through the universe by consuming the civilizations it finds. This is the true scope of what Unitology was worshipping, and what EarthGov was attempting to harness. The convergence they both sought, from opposite directions and for opposite stated reasons, was the consumption of humanity. Sit with that for a moment, because the scale of it is the point, and the scale is where Dead Space makes its final argument about hopelessness. Everything we've discussed, the design of the Ishimura, the manipulation of Isaac's grief, the institutional betrayals of Unitology and EarthGov, the 3 years in the asylum, the outbreak on the sprawl, all of it was local, small, a corner of a process running at galactic distances and geological timescales. The Church of Unitology was built around a manufactured martyrdom, pursuing a goal its founders monetized and its believers misunderstood. But that goal was, at the largest scale, a real thing. Convergence was coming. The mechanics of it were simply different from the sermon. EarthGov was attempting to harness the output of something that treats civilizations as raw material. Their scientists were trying to use a cosmic harvesting machine as an energy source, the way a person might try to redirect a river by holding out their hands. The scale mismatch between the institution and the thing it was attempting to manage is almost too large to think about directly. And Isaac Clarke, one man, a systems engineer from a mining corporation, was at the center of all of it, because the red marker on Aegis 7 happened to imprint a replicable blueprint into his specific neural patterns, which made his specific mind useful to specific institutions pursuing specific agendas, none of which had anything to do with whether he survived or mattered as a person. A civilization that encountered the markers before humanity did manage to build something remarkable. On Tau Volantis, a species that has been gone long enough that their biology is preserved only in ice, they engineered a machine capable of suppressing the marker signal over a planetary area. When their own convergence threatened to complete, they activated the machine and froze the process. The moon that would have formed over Tau Volantis was stopped mid-assembly, frozen in orbit, dormant but not destroyed. The aliens who built the machine apparently did not survive long afterward. Their achievement was the machine, and the machine held, for a very long time it held. The sovereign colony's armed forces discovered what remained of this work during their own period of marker research. They understood enough of what they found to recognize the scale of the threat the machine was suppressing. Their record survived into the period of Dead Space 3, when Isaac's team followed the triangulated signal back to Tau Volantis. By that point, the marker replication program that EarthGov had run, spreading marker copies to colonies across human space, had distributed the infection so widely that the Circle, led by Jacob Danick, was able to begin activating those markers simultaneously. Outbreaks were triggered across human settlements on a broad scale. Convergence events began on multiple worlds. Here is something the lore of Dead Space 3 makes clear that reframes everything the first two games presented as personal and local. The message, "Make us whole," was not originating as an independent impulse from within individual markers. It was the signal from the frozen Tau Volantis moon, transmitted through the marker network, received by every marker in human-controlled space, and interpreted by every human mind that the marker signal had touched. The hallucination of Nicole telling Isaac to make us whole. The religious doctrine of Unitology, built around reunion and wholeness. The obsessive behavior of marker survivors who carved the symbols repeatedly without understanding why. All of it was a single signal, received at different levels of comprehension by different people, interpreted through their own frameworks of loss and longing. The Tau Volantis moon had been asking, for an unknown length of time, for someone to come to Tau Volantis and turn off the machine. Isaac followed the signal to its source. H.P. Lovecraft's horror fiction was built around a single philosophical idea, that the universe is ancient beyond human comprehension, indifferent to human existence, populated by intelligences so vast and so alien that meaningful communication with them is impossible, and that direct perception of these truths is enough to shatter a human mind. What made his stories frightening was not that the entities in them were hostile. Several of them were simply operating according to their own nature and scale, with no particular interest in humanity beyond the way a person might notice ants before deciding to sit down somewhere. The horror came from scale disparity, from the moment of recognition that human experience, in the context of what the universe actually contains, is too small to register. Dead Space earned this comparison slowly, across 3 games. The first game was personal. A man on a ship, fighting creatures that used to be people, driven by love and guilt. The second game was psychological. A man fighting his own mind in a space station that looked like civilization until it didn't. By the third game, the franchise had arrived somewhere in the same territory Lovecraft was always describing. An entity the size of a planet, composed of the harvested civilizations of countless species, coordinating through a signal network that has been running for longer than humanity has existed, reaching out through every marker that any of us ever touched, or built, or worshipped, or tried to weaponize. The Brethren Moons are not evil in the personal sense that the franchise's earlier human antagonists were evil. Tiedemann was evil in a recognizable way, institutional ambition overriding human cost. Danick was evil in a recognizable way, ideological certainty justifying mass harm. The Brethren Moons are not choosing to harm humanity in any sense that implies they understand humanity as individual people. The harvesting process is simply what they are and what they do, as automatic and impersonal as the pull of gravity. That impersonality is its own kind of horror. You can argue with a person. You can expose an institution's contradictions. You can resist an ideology by demonstrating its consequences. You cannot make a planet-sized necromorph reconsider its approach to civilizations by appealing to its sense of fairness. Dead Space's universe ends at Tau Volantis, with a machine that was built by people who understood the scale of what they were facing and tried anyway. They failed, or partially failed. The moon was stopped but not destroyed, and the people who built the machine were lost regardless. Their achievement was preservation rather than victory. They bought time, not for themselves, for whoever came next. If anyone came next, if anyone could follow the signal and find what they left behind and understand enough of it to do something. Isaac found it, what he was able to do with it, and whether it counted as a victory, and what it would have meant for the franchise's larger story if that story had continued, are questions the series leaves open. The Brethren Moon network was never fully dismantled. The markers had been distributed too widely across human space for any single confrontation on Tau Volantis to resolve the larger pattern. The machine the aliens built held one moon for an unknown span of time. That was the scale of what could be achieved, and yet the franchise's central figure kept moving through all of it. That persistence, the continuing motion of one man through a system specifically designed to consume him, is the thing Chapter 10 has to account for. Because the hopelessness is real and demonstrable and carefully built across 3 games and decades of lore, and people kept playing. That's not nothing. That might, in fact, be the whole point. Chapter 10: Why We Keep Playing. Let's start with something that sounds like it should have a simple answer. Dead Space is a horror game designed to make you feel powerless. Its mechanics are built around scarcity and strategy invalidation. Its lore is built around institutional betrayal and cosmic indifference. Its protagonist spends 3 games being used by people and forces that regard his survival as secondary to their agendas. The ending of the 3rd game, in the broadest sense, does not resolve the threat so much as it demonstrates the ceiling of what a person can do against something operating at a galactic scale. Why does any of this make people want to play it? Why does it make them want to finish it, replay it, read the audio logs, watch the cutscenes again, search through lore documents for details the game didn't explain clearly? Research into why people seek out horror experiences has produced a consistent and somewhat counterintuitive finding. Fear, in contexts where the person experiencing it knows they are not genuinely in danger, functions differently from fear in real emergencies. The physiological response is similar, but the cognitive overlay changes everything. When the brain registers that a threat is present while simultaneously knowing the threat cannot cause real harm, the arousal that fear produces becomes available for a different kind of processing. The elevated heart rate, the sharpened attention, the adrenaline, all of it is experienced without the requirement to actually flee or fight anything. The energy has nowhere necessary to go. In those conditions, research has found people tend to experience the state as pleasurable rather than distressing. This is sometimes called benign masochism. The willingness to seek out and sustain negative sensory or emotional experiences when the cognitive system is confident enough in its safety that the suffering can be enjoyed rather than endured. Spicy food, sad music, horror movies, survival horror games. The mechanism is the same across all of them. You know you're okay. Your body doesn't fully know that. The gap between those 2 things produces something that functions, for many people, like a reward. Dead Space is an exceptionally effective delivery system for that experience. But that explanation only covers the surface of why the game resonates as specifically as it does. The benign masochism account explains why people play horror games in general. It doesn't explain why Dead Space specifically connects with people in the particular way that it does, why players come back to it, why the franchise has a dedicated community of people who've spent years reading audio logs and building detailed accounts of the lore, why a remake released in 2023 was received not just as a technical achievement, but as an emotional return to something that mattered. For that, you need to look at what Dead Space is actually about. Underneath the dismemberment and the necromorphs and the cosmic horror, Dead Space is about the experience of being inside systems that were not built with your well-being as their primary concern, about the specific kind of helplessness that comes from discovering that the institutions around you had information you didn't have, made decisions that affected you without your input, and regarded your interests as secondary to goals you were never told about. The Ishimura's crew didn't know their mission had a religious agenda hidden inside a corporate one. Isaac didn't know he was being used for 2 years while he slept. The people of the sprawl didn't know they were living adjacent to a marker research installation. Each of these is a version of a feeling that is broadly familiar to people living inside any large modern institution. The feeling that the picture you've been given of what's happening around you is incomplete in ways that specifically disadvantage you. Research into why horror fiction is appealing to people who have experienced trauma or powerlessness has found that engaging with horror narratives can function as a form of controlled processing. The emotional content of real experiences of helplessness or betrayal encountered inside a fictional frame that the reader or player can exit at any time becomes manageable in ways that the real experience was not. The horror game gives you an exit. It gives you the controller. The institutional betrayals of real life don't offer either. Dead Space takes real anxieties about institutional trust, about the gap between what people are told and what is actually happening, about the experience of being a resource rather than a person inside large organizational structures, and it makes them literally and unmistakably true in its universe. The game doesn't metaphorize these things, it literalizes them. EarthGov literally drugged Isaac and extracted information from his brain without his consent. The CEC literally sent its crew on a mission whose real purpose was kept from them. The Church of Unitology literally built a religion on a manufactured martyrdom to profit from people's genuine spiritual needs. For anyone who has felt that real institutions have operated on them in ways that prioritize the institution's needs over their own, Dead Space recognizes that feeling with unusual directness. It doesn't dress it up, it doesn't soften the edges. It follows the logic of institutional indifference to its honest conclusion, which is a sealed ship full of transformed former people and one engineer trying to figure out what happened, without any of the context that would have let him understand it before it reached him. That recognition is not comfortable. It is also not nothing. There's something else the game offers, and it's the thing that keeps players finishing it rather than putting it down when the hopelessness becomes fully apparent. Isaac survives. He survives the Ishimura, which was designed through a chain of human decisions to be a place no one survived. He survives the sprawl, where EarthGov's program reached its conclusion and the marker nearly completed its work through him. He survives Tau Volantis, where the scale of the threat was finally made fully visible. His survival is never safe or comfortable or achieved through the kind of heroic competence that makes victories feel earned in simple ways. His survival looks more like persistence than triumph. He keeps moving when there are no good options. He makes decisions with incomplete information. He destroys markers that should have destroyed him first. He is never in control in any meaningful sense, and he never stops acting as though his actions might matter anyway. That combination, the actual hopelessness alongside the continued motion through it, is the thing Dead Space is really doing with you over its total runtime. Research into human response to persistent adversity has found that the relationship between a person's sense of control and their ability to continue functioning is more nuanced than simple models suggest. Complete certainty that your actions don't matter does produce the helplessness response described earlier. But a person who accepts that their control is limited, that the system around them is larger than they are, and not arranged for their benefit, while continuing to make choices and take actions within that understanding, does not behave the same way as someone who has stopped trying entirely. The acknowledgement of limited agency is different from the surrender of all agency, and the research suggests people who can make that distinction, who can keep moving inside a situation they know is larger than they can resolve, tend to function better than those who need complete control as a precondition of action. Dead Space teaches that distinction experientially over the course of 3 games. You begin the first game convinced, if you've played horror games before, that you understand how this works. The dismemberment system confirms that conviction briefly. Then the game begins the work of dismantling it. By the end of Dead Space 3, you have spent dozens of hours inside a situation whose scale and whose institutional architecture were both much larger than anything any individual could reasonably be expected to navigate. And you made it through anyway, not because you controlled the situation, because you kept moving inside it. Think about which character in this story you have the most complicated feeling about by the end. Not the most sympathy for, necessarily. The most complicated feeling. It might be Isaac, whose survival required things that cost him more than the game always acknowledges. It might be Nicole, whose final moments on the Ishimura were spent trying to help people while knowing she was going to lose, and whose death was then used as a tool against the person she loved. It might be Strauss, who understood the marker's nature more clearly than almost anyone, and was destroyed by that understanding before he could use it to do anything useful. All 3 of them were inside something they didn't design. All 3 of them were affected by decisions made by people with more information and more institutional power. All three of them moved through the consequences of those decisions with different resources and different results. Dead Space asks you to sit with that, with the gap between what the people in this story deserved and what they got, with the institutional logic that produced that gap, with the cosmic indifference that makes the institutional logic seem small by comparison, with the one engineer who kept moving through all of it, not because the situation was winnable in any clean sense, but because stopping was the alternative. The Brethren Moons are still out there in the franchise's lore. The marker network is still sending its signal. The process that consumed civilizations before humanity encountered it will continue after the specific confrontations of the three games are done. Individual survival against those coordinates barely registers, and yet Dead Space persists as an experience. It gets remade. People return to it. They read the audio logs more carefully the second time. They catch details they missed. They come back to the chapter titles and count the letters. The game knew from the beginning. It told you from the beginning. The truth was always visible to whoever was paying the right kind of attention. That's what Dead Space does, across every layer it operates on. The mechanics, the lore, the institutions, the cosmic scale. The truth is there. The frame around it is designed to make it hard to see until you're already inside the consequences. The only question the game leaves genuinely open is the same question it poses every time you pick up the controller. Knowing what you know about how this ends, about what's really going on, about how small your agency actually is inside all of this, do you keep going anyway? Most people do. That answer means something, even if Dead Space never tells you exactly what. Dead Space was never trying to scare you into feeling better. It wasn't building toward a clean resolution or a moment of triumph that would leave you feeling safe. It was building toward the specific, uncomfortable clarity that comes from understanding a system completely, including the parts of it that were working against you before you arrived. The hopelessness is real. The design confirms it. The lore confirms it. The institutions confirm it. The Brethren Moons confirm it at a scale that makes everything else look like a local problem. And people keep playing. Maybe that's the most honest thing the franchise has to say. Maybe persistence inside something larger than you, with limited information and imperfect tools, and the full knowledge that the system wasn't built for you, is what passes for hope, when hope in the traditional sense ran out somewhere around Chapter 3 of a ship called the Ishimura.